I didn't think they liked me. You know, that you always think there's some people in the audience who hate you. So you get nervous, you know.
Even one of the most beloved members of the Beatles had his share of difficult relationships in the music world. Paul McCartney, despite his reputation for charm and creating timeless music, wasn't always friendly with other musicians. Behind his public image, there were rivalries, creative disagreements, and personal conflicts that shaped how he viewed certain artists in the industry. The Oasis controversy. The Beatles are widely regarded as the band that changed popular music forever. Their influence was so enormous that almost every major group that came after them showed some trace of their sound or approach. One band that borrowed heavily from the Beatles was Oasis, the confident Manchester group that dominated British pop music in the 1990s with their bold attitude, powerful guitars, and songs designed for massive crowds. Oasis clearly drew inspiration from Lennon and McCartney's harmonies. Their look reminded people of the 1960s, and they seemed to have unlimited ambition. Given how openly Oasis admired the Beatles, it might have made sense for Paul McCartney to see them as worthy followers, or at least appreciate their tribute to his band's legacy. However, for many years, the opposite was true. Instead of showing admiration, McCartney criticized them harshly, and this wasn't really about their musical style, but rather about their overconfident attitude. The problem that sparked McCartney's dislike happened in 1996. During the peak of British pop music, Noel Gallagher, who played guitar and wrote most of Oasis's songs, made a statement that would follow the band for decades. In an interview with MTV, Gallagher boldly claimed that Oasis's first two albums made them better than the Beatles. This was an incredibly bold statement that seemed to cross a sacred line in music. For many people, the Beatles weren't just another band. They were the gold standard of modern cheers in music. To casually claim to be better than them seemed both ridiculous and disrespectful. Years later, Gallagher admitted that he had been under the influence of drugs when he made that comment, suggesting it was reckless rather than intentional. But by then, the damage was already done. The remarks spread quickly, cementing Oasis's reputation as arrogant newcomers who believed they could overthrow the very icons they copied. Paul McCartney, not surprisingly, didn't take the comparison well. In 1997, he spoke out against Oasis with words that were particularly cutting. He called them derivative and said they thought too much of themselves, adding that they meant nothing to him. Coming from McCartney, who rarely attacked other musicians publicly, this was especially harsh. His use of the word derivative was devastating, particularly for a band whose entire sound was built on borrowing and reworking elements of the Beatles' style. To McCartney, Oasis were not innovators, but simply imitators who had been inflated by their own publicity. By 2001, McCartney had softened his position somewhat when he clarified his thoughts during an interview. He explained that his initial attitude toward Oasis had actually been positive. He liked their energy, their songwriting, and their potential. But Noel Gallagher's outrageous claim had soured that goodwill. He admitted that he had only said they were slightly derivative and hadn't criticized them as much as people thought. His words suggested that deep down, he respected Oasis's music, but couldn't ignore the arrogance that overshadowed it. For McCartney, the problem wasn't simply that Oasis borrowed from the Beatles. Countless bands had done that before. The issue was that instead of acknowledging this debt with humility, Oasis seemed to enjoy it while simultaneously boasting that they could surpass their heroes. This contradicted. On seemed hollow, and McCartney had no patience for it. As time passed, however, rivalries began to soften. By the 2010s, Oasis had broken up, and their reign had become a memory carried by fans of that era. The band's turbulent history, marked by fights between the Gallagher brothers, legendary concerts, and a spectacular breakup, had turned them into cult figures. McCartney, with the wisdom that comes with age and experience, looked back with less bitterness. In a 2016 interview, he admitted that Oasis had been young, fresh, and writing good songs. He even praised their early work, acknowledging the excitement they brought to the music scene. Yet he couldn't resist pointing out what he saw as their fatal mistake. He thought their biggest error was saying they were going to be bigger than the Beatles, noting that many people had said that before, and it was the kiss of death. McCartney's comment revealed not only his perspective on Oasis, but also his understanding of music history. Many bands had tried to surpass the Beatles, and nearly all had failed. Claiming to be bigger than the Beatles wasn't just arrogant. It invited ridicule and pressure that no group could survive. The Rolling Stones comparison. When people think of Paul McCartney, they usually picture the charming, approachable former Beatle who seems friendly and thoughtful in interviews. But anyone who has studied his career closely knows that this public image hides a deeply competitive spirit. McCartney, like his late songwriting partner John Lennon, is driven by a desire to excel and ensure that his work stands above the rest. This competitive drive extends even to longtime friends and fellow rock legends. In 2021, McCartney caused international headlines with comments about the Rolling Stones that seemed to walk the line between admiration and criticism. While discussing the Beatles' legacy compared to the famous rock band, he made a comment that many interpreted as subtle mockery. He said he wasn't sure he should say it, but the Rolling Stones were essentially a blues cover band, and he thought the Beatles had cast a wider net musically. These words, delivered in McCartney's typically measured tone, nevertheless caused quite a stir. Fans, critics, and the media analyzed his statement, debating whether it showed insecurity, playful provocation, or an honest reflection of musical reality. For those familiar with McCartney's personality, this wasn't entirely unexpected, as he has long been willing to voice opinions that others might keep private. This wasn't the first time he had compared the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, though it was the first instance that received widespread attention. Speaking to a radio host in 2020, McCartney had framed the comparison more diplomatically. He admitted that the Stones were a fantastic group rooted in the blues, but when they wrote songs, it had to do with the blues, whereas the Beatles had more varied influences. He concluded by saying he loved the Stones, but the Beatles were better. The distinction McCartney draws here is subtle but revealing. He isn't dismissing the Rolling Stones, who are, after all, one of the most influential rock bands in history. Instead, he emphasizes that the Beatles' strength lay in diversity and experimentation. The Beatles drew from many sources: classical music, Indian instruments, experimental techniques, folk music, and even electronic sounds. The Rolling Stones, brilliant as they are, were firmly rooted in the blues, and their genius showed primarily through their live performances and stage presence. For McCartney, comparing breadth of influence and studio innovation isn't meant as an insult, but as an observation about artistic scope. Interestingly, McCartney's comments didn't spark any public anger from the Stones themselves. Mick Jagger, the B8's charismatic lead singer, responded with characteristic grace. Rather than starting a feud, Jagger maintained that there was, obviously, no competition between the two groups. He even extended a friendly gesture, inviting McCartney to collaborate on a track for the Rolling Stones' 2023 album. This response reflects an essential truth about the relationship between McCartney and the Stones. For decades, the two bands have been compared in the public imagination. The Beatles as the experimental, carefully crafted studio architects, and the Stones as the raw, powerful masters of blues-driven rock and stadium spectacle. McCartney, fiercely proud of the Beatles' innovation, naturally emphasized these distinctions when asked to compare the bands. The Madonna jealousy. When it comes to public rivalries in music, few would think to put Paul McCartney and Madonna in the same conversation. McCartney, one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century, built his legacy as a Beatle and later as a solo artist who defined melodic pop. Madonna, on the other hand, emerged in the 1980s as the queen of pop, thriving on controversy, constant reinvention, and spectacular shows. They represented different worlds. McCartney as the classic rock aristocrat, and Madonna as the fearless boundary pusher who challenged conventions. Yet despite these contrasts, McCartney admitted in rare moments of honesty that he carried deep resentment toward Madonna's success. This revelation came in a 2015 book, where the former Beatle opened up about his insecurities in ways fans weren't used to hearing. Though McCartney was usually diplomatic when speaking about other artists, when the subject turned to Madonna, he didn't hold back. He confessed that he often found her overwhelming popularity difficult to accept. It wasn't that he disliked her music, or her as a person. It was the cultural phenomenon surrounding her that bothered him. He complained that she was treated like a goddess, and his words carried a mixture of sarcasm and envy. He explained that when people saw Madonna on television or in the press, They elevated her to an almost divine status. This frustration, McCartney admitted, wasn't just about Madonna, but about how fame works in general. Still, he singled her out as an example of how the public creates myths around certain figures. He described how once she went on tour, selling out huge venues, people saw her as a goddess because of her elaborate costumes and performances. His words painted a picture of an internal struggle, knowing he himself had once been worshipped on the same level as Madonna, but now being forced to compete with a new generation of idols. To some, McCartney's comments might have sounded surprisingly bitter. After all, he had little reason to feel threatened by Madonna, since their music didn't compete directly, and his legacy was already cemented in rock history, while hers dominated pop charts and MTV. But McCartney explained the truth behind his resentment: simple jealousy. He admitted that during the early 1990s, he viewed figures like Madonna and Michael Jackson as rivals. Even though his fame came from an earlier era, he still watched the charts and measured his own relevance against theirs. He confessed that during his tours in the 1990s, Madonna was the artist he was most worried about competing with. This honesty revealed something essential about McCartney. Despite his calm and friendly public image, he remained competitive, still chasing the kind of dominance he had enjoyed in the 1960s. Watching Madonna dominate the pop world, reinvent herself with each album, and fill arenas across the globe made him uneasy. She represented everything he was trying to keep up with: youth, innovation, and cultural relevance. Madonna, for her part, likely never worried about McCartney's remarks. She built her career on boldness and refusing to care about critics, which allowed her to survive scandals, reinvent herself through countless eras, and maintain her status as pop royalty long after others faded. Interestingly, Madonna wasn't even a great fan of the Beatles to begin with. While the Beatles were reshaping rock music in the 1960s, she was more drawn to Motown artists. To her, the Beatles weren't sacred. They were simply another act in music history. The Phil Collins encounter. Few musicians can claim a life so deeply connected to the Beatles as Phil Collins. From his earliest days, the Liverpool Quartet served as both inspiration and obsession. As a young boy, Collins absorbed their records, taking in the melodies, harmonies, and inventive songwriting that would later influence his own music. His admiration was so intense that as a teenager, he even appeared as an extra in one of the Beatles' first movies, a small role, but a memory that strengthened his connection to the band. Collins' relationship with the Beatles deepened as his career developed. He had the rare privilege of working with George Harrison during the recording sessions for Harrison's 1970 solo album. That collaboration represented a dream realized for a young man whose musical path had been shaped by the Beatles' sound. Yet even in this golden period, Collins experienced the sting of being left out when he was omitted from portions of the album, a decision that haunted him for years. If being excluded from Harrison's landmark album was painful, what happened years later would leave an even more lasting mark on Collins' memory. By 2002, Collins had become a global star in his own right, commanding respect and admiration across musical genres. One would assume that meeting Paul McCartney, a man who symbolized the pinnacle of musical achievement, would be celebratory, or at least friendly. Unfortunately, the reality was far from that. Collins described the incident in a 2016 interview, his voice still showing frustration years later. He met McCartney at a formal party at Buckingham Palace in 2002. Collins had brought along a first-edition Beatles book, hoping to get McCartney's autograph. He approached the former Beatle expecting warm mutual recognition. Instead, he was met with a comment that cut deeply. According to Collins, McCartney approached with his then-wife, and when Collins asked for an autograph, McCartney said something like, "Oh, our little Phil's a bit of a Beatles fan." Collins was shocked and hurt by what he saw as a condescending remark. For someone who had devoted his life to music and had always honored the Beatles, the comment felt belittling and almost childish. Collins explained that McCartney had a way of talking that made people feel small, as if he was thinking, "I know this must be hard for you because I'm a Beatle, and it must be very difficult for you to actually hold a conversation with me." The encounter, set in one of the most formal and prestigious locations in the United Kingdom, left Collins feeling diminished, a sensation that didn't match his own accomplishments. The story didn't remain private for long. When word of Collins's displeasure reached McCartney, the former Beatle responded not with a formal apology, but with a practical message encouraging both parties to move past the incident. It was a gesture of closure rather than reconciliation, acknowledging that some slights, whether intended or not, might best be left behind. Yet Collins felt compelled to discuss the episode publicly. In later interviews, he reflected on the incident with a mix of regret and determination. While he expressed regret if his words caused McCartney any offense, he insisted that speaking out was necessary. Without acknowledgement, he argued, the behavior would remain unexamined and unchanged. The Michael Jackson betrayal. Few stories in pop history illustrate the collision of genius, ambition, and betrayal, quite like the relationship between Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson. On the surface, the partnership seemed perfect. McCartney, the experienced Beatle and masterful songwriter, had decades of experience creating lasting hits. Jackson, the global pop phenomenon, was already at the height of his fame, a figure whose voice and charisma crossed all boundaries. Their connection began in the late 1970s, when Jackson recorded a cover of a Wings song for his landmark 1979 album. McCartney, intrigued and flattered by Jackson's enthusiasm for his music, responded warmly. This mutual admiration led to one of pop music's most famous collaborations on Jackson's 1982 Thriller album, where they sang together on The Girl Is Mine. The song, a playful romantic duet, showcased their vocal chemistry and suggested a friendship built on both music and mutual respect. The partnership continued with McCartney's solo work in 1983, when they recorded together again. At first glance, the collaboration seemed seamless, two of the biggest names in music working together to create tracks that would dominate charts and radio. But beneath the polished production and catchy melodies, tensions were quietly building. According to reports, problems began during their recording sessions. McCartney, who had long advocated for songwriter rights, advised Jackson to invest his enormous fortune in music publishing. McCartney understood the power of owning musical compositions from his own experience with the Beatles' rights after the band split. He assumed Jackson, with his unprecedented success, would follow this advice. Unfortunately for McCartney, Jackson's ambition extended beyond collaboration to acquisition. The break came on August 14, 1985, in a move that would forever change their relationship. Jackson purchased the publishing rights to the majority of the Beatles' catalog for $47 million. To the casual observer, this might have seemed like a standard business transaction, but for McCartney, it was deeply personal. Since 1969, due to mismanagement of his and Lennon's publishing company, McCartney had not been receiving the royalties he deserved. He had even considered bidding to reclaim control of the catalog to secure what was legally and emotionally his. But Jackson, using his position as the world's most famous entertainer, outmaneuvered him easily. McCartney was left stunned and outraged. In interviews, he didn't hide his frustration, calling it dodgy to do something like that and comparing it to being someone's friend and then buying the rug they're standing on. The statement captured not only the personal betrayal, but the sense of exploitation he felt. It was more than a business maneuver. It was a violation of trust, showing that in the high-stakes world of music publishing, friendship could be sacrificed for strategy and ambition. Jackson, for his part, remained mostly quiet about the controversy at the time. However, hints of acknowledgement appeared years later in his 1989 autobiography, where he reflected on the lessons learned from the episode. He wrote that both he and Paul had learned the hard way about business, noting the importance of publishing and the dignity of songwriting. His comments seemed to frame the acquisition less as a betrayal and more as a harsh but inevitable lesson in the music industry's brutal realities. The relationship between McCartney and Jackson never fully recovered from this incident. What had started as a promising friendship and creative partnership between two of music's biggest stars ended in bitterness and legal complications. The story serves as a reminder that in the music business, even the closest relationships can be destroyed by financial conflicts and competing ambitions. This tale of friendship turned sour illustrates the complex dynamics that exist in the music industry, where artistic collaboration often intersects with business interests. It shows how even the most successful artists must navigate not only creative challenges, but also the complicated world of music rights, publishing, and ownership that can make or break careers and relationships.